go over a little myth busting, some facts about resilience so we know kind of attitudes to take. Uh, Resilient people have emotions, and we have the skill, or they have the skill, to regulate those emotions. So that's being aware of what's going on, to actually feel and experience those emotions, and then tactics and states that they can regulate those emotions so that they can like minimize overwhelm or activation, still behave appropriately in a professional environment or a personal environment. If we have emotions, if we learn to regulate them and work with them, that is what a resilient person does, versus just suppressing those emotions or denying them, because they're gonna happen. Remember that they are basically the signaling mechanism from our survival brain and our nervous system about what that survival brain is perceiving, both in the external environment and then in the internal environment. So they are signals, and we're better off and more effective if we're receiving them and responding to them. Resilience, as I've tried to underscore with the importance of authentic communication, is about individuals and relationships. So it's not the lone ranger, even he had a sidekick. It is about community and groups and how we support each other and gain support from each other. So this is also really highlighted in an earlier discussion, if you recall, about as we move further down that stress continuum, into orange and red, we tend to often self-isolate because maybe we don't want to share the bad news or embarrassed or whatnot. A person that's more highly skilled in resilience is going to actually recognize that natural trend and reaction and counteract it by building in social support and social interaction. Man, I would say I remember a heartbreaking call, frankly. It was an individual who was struggling during a height of the pandemic, feeling a lot of anxiety, and had the courage to talk to his officer, consequently his battalion chief, and then me. And in talking to that individual, he said that making the call to his officer that he wasn't doing well was the hardest thing that he's ever done in the fire service. And he said something to me that struck me, which was that there's all these other really tough guys and they're handling this. And so I wondered what was wrong with me because I wasn't handling it. But what he really demonstrated was a really good resilient skill of asking for help, and seeking it out, because South Metro has a 30+ person peer support team and we're busy all of the time. Our EAP is well used, and frequently by many of our members. We don't get through this life alone. We weren't built to get through this life alone. The past 200,000 years of our history is us living and working in small communities to get through this life together. So if you want to be resilient, you will develop the ability and the skill and the resources to ask for help when you need it. We really want to be in a place where we are building our capacity to respond to ever more challenging situations, as opposed to just letting our automatic reactions take over. And basically that is because those automatic reactions are also fast, but then they're kind of stupid. There's not a lot of nuance to that survival brain. It's just going to send out alerts when it sees patterns. So what we want to be doing is be aware of that, how that's working, and then put ourselves in a place where we can respond productively to more things. It's not always pretty to be a resilient person. It's a hot mess. If anybody, I feel like I'm in a good place now. I feel like I'm flourishing. I know other people that are, and I know that I was a hot chocolate mess at parts of my career. I went through all these level experiences like all of us did. So fully composed people that are composed all the time, I will tell you this. One is they're probably not living and seeing reality as it is, and or they're very good about suppressing their emotions and what they're feeling. Um, we can be fully composed at some avenues, but if you just think about your own life honestly, maybe we can, it's probably easier to be composed at work, right? When things are going well, we don't think things personally, but also at home, it's a lot easier to get triggered by maybe your spouse or your kids or whatnot when things are personally. So that's just part of life. It ain't always pretty to be someone that's on the struggle towards through survival, coping, and flourishing. Moving on, we all start with the different baseline level of resilience, and then that's impacted by our childhood and our upbringing and whatever else. But we can all develop more resilience no matter how brittle or resilient you might be. There are skills involved in doing it, and there's practices involved. And if we develop those skills and we pursue those practices, then we become more resilient. So it's not a fixed attribute. Finally, and most importantly, recovery and rejuvenation fuel resilience. In order to remain resilient, we need to understand that stress cycle and the need for recovery. And frankly, I would love to see South Metro, not only as an organization, but just as individuals, we need to start valuing and coveting and praising rest and recovery more. And that is both during our shifts, whenever we can get sleep, but also very importantly, when we're at home and prioritizing things like pursuing activities that recharge us, pursuing 8 hours of sleep at night, all of these things that we would be engaged in if we were in a athletic event. So we need to recharge our bodies and our minds and our social structures in order to remain resilient. It's an active, engaging process. Okay, let's move on to principles and tactics. So the big principle, the magic bullet of increasing your resilience as far as your nervous system goes, is to have small wins. Remember that survival brain is learning, so it's actually being conditioned through observing the stimulus and response of the body, so that every time that we can respond productively or in a healthy or skillful way to even a mild amount of stress, then we are signaling to that survival brain, it's learning that we have capability in that regard. So it just learns that stressors equals a productive reaction, and then it doesn't have to be as quote unquote like concerned about them. So we're just going to be looking for small ways in which we productively respond to our stress levels of activation. I've harped on this quite a bit. Our physical, mental, and social health are all tied together, and they all matter. So we should be seeking out ways to improve those whenever we can, because they're all codependent. All right, so tactics. We're going to use these in two time frames. One is that survival time frame when you're maybe highly activated, or you're in a really difficult circumstances, and then we just need to get through it. So what will really inhibit us to get through in a productive way of difficult situations is if we're so triggered that we can't think clearly, so that that survival brain has taken over, the crazy monkey is driving the bus, we're not making good thought processes. If we can reduce our stress response in the moment, then we can bring that thinking brain back online and be able to have a more productive response to our situation instead of being automatically reacting to it. And then as far as offline tactics, that's going to be in that coping and then the flourishing growth stage of resilience, excuse me. We are going to look to change our states basically, but we're setting ourselves up and learning skills at that point so that we reduce the probability of false alarms. What that means is we reduce how reactive we are to any given stressor. And as we do that, we build our capacity to handle more and more stressful situations until maybe that survival brain goes into override and takes over. So we're building our capacity in various ways before we're activated. And by doing that, by teaching that survival brain and regulating in real time and then building these skills off time, we're actually changing our relationship to stress so that it's something that we can productively sense and then respond to. And then when we know that we can respond to something, that we have that capability, we're less likely to be reactive to it. So the real-time tactics is going to involve our breathing. And because of So the onto real-time tactics and the nitty-gritty. The object is to reduce our stress response in the moment. To do that, we're going to use our breathing. Our breathing is effective because the areas of the brain that control alertness and stress are directly linked to our breathing centers as well. We know this when we're maybe anxious or stressed out and our breathing becomes shallow or more rapidly. So that's the survival brain basically sending signals to our breathing centers. But that wiring is bidirectional. So whereas our survival brain it's unconsciously signaling to our respiratory system that it's got to fight, and so our respiratory system changes. We can use our thinking brain to consciously change our respiratory pattern, and then that the perception of that changed respiratory pattern will then change the level of arousal in our survival brain. There's two basic modes of breathing. If we breathe in a way where our breaths are a little bit shorter in inhalation and then it's longer for exhalation, so if we take twice as long to breathe out as we do to breathe in, then it'd look like. So a lot of us has done that already. When we do that, it downregulates our nervous system. When we breathe in with emphasis on the inhale, that upregulates our system. So you could try these things. If it's the afternoon when you're watching it and you're feeling a little drowsy, pause this and take 8 to 10 really quick breaths, like hyperventilation, and then notice the difference in your arousal level. Conversely, if you're feeling irritated, maybe at my voice, maybe it's something in this presentation or at another time, or even if you're just sitting there relatively neutral, take a few exhale emphasized breaths and feel the difference in your nervous system. But those are going to be our primary real-time tactics. With the caveat that breathing isn't neutral for everybody because of our various experiences. Maybe we have a medical condition with that. There are other tactics that we can use, but it's not universal that everybody has access to that breath in a way that's not loaded for some reasons. Our offline tactics are going to be anything that we are working on as far as skill development or perspective or focal points when we're not highly activated. So this is in levels that we're mildly or moderately activated. The reason we won't want to be deliberately training or trying to develop new skills when we're highly activated is because we can't. We don't learn that way if we're overactivated and that survival brain is online. Our thinking brain is then offline, and so we don't have that explicit memory, so we don't learn well in highly stressful environments. So as an example, we don't teach people how to start an IV on a core zero. Go for it. We need your IV or this person's going to die, right? We teach them in a controlled environment, and then we step it up along the way on routine medical calls. And then when they have developed the skills, they can then apply them in a more stressful situation. But the model that we're going to use is just to respond productively to ever increasing amounts of stress. First, like when we have none, we're going to learn to control our breathing. And then in areas of our day, maybe where we know that we have some mild stress activation, we're going to plan to implement those breathing skills at that point. And then we can look for areas where maybe we have more activation. So not necessarily stressed out, but maybe we just have more, arousal. This might be when you're responding to a certain type of call. You just will pre-plan ahead. It's like, all right, when I get in the rig, I'm going to check out the MDT, hit responding or whatever it is, and then I'm going to take a couple deep breaths. And it's not that you have to calm down in that moment. We just tend to be a little bit more aroused in some situations than others. So that's how it's going to work. We're going to implement these skills on ever increasing levels of activation. When we do this, our survival brain is noticing that level of activation and the use of a calming skill like that, and it's imprinting that when activated, the body, the nervous system has the capability of reducing the stress. And that changes, so to speak, the way in which the survival brain is perceiving stressors, it decreases it. And then when the survival brain, and I'm using a lot of thinking terms with the survival brain, that's not totally how it works, but for illustration purposes, when that survival brain perceives that it has the ability to recover, then it will sense less threat and it will go into recovery on its own. The other offline tactic that we're going to use is we want to change like our baseline state of stress and arousal. So thinking about the stress continuum, where we are on it, the more often we can spend the time in the green, or even the more fully green we are versus yellow, orange, and red, the more robust we're going to be, the more regulated our nervous system will be used to being. And so it senses that as a like secure home base, and so to speak. And then also when we're rested, when we're physically and mentally and socially healthy, once again, we just have more resources, both intellectually and physically, and better social resources to deal with anything that would arise. All right, so we are going to shift our states and acquire new traits through the use of intentional breathing, developing the habit of using our breathing to change our states and the awareness of where our breathing is, and then the skill of meditation, which is simply attentional training. So it's the ability to pay attention to what's going on with you internally, most specifically with non-judgmental awareness. This is important because with the capacity to be able to pay attention to what we want to pay attention to or what we need to pay attention to, so how do we shift states and acquire new traits? We're going to use an intentional breathing. So understanding when we're breathing quickly, but using our breathing to control our level of activation is going to develop that skill and allow us to get in greater states of rest and recovery. That's going to signal our survival brain that we have the capacity to overcome these things. And we're going to develop a greater ability to pay attention to what we want to pay attention to when we need to pay attention to it. And specifically, what is going on with us internally. So this is really all that meditation is. It's a formal way. Well, formal is not exactly the right word. It's a purposeful way in which we develop the capacity to pay attention to things and not be distracted by our thoughts. So we're going to use those two things to change our states in a way and develop more capacity so that we have those traits that those capacities bring. Let's wrap up by getting a little more nuanced about stress. And the reason I want to do that is because it provides a good illustration of focusing on the things under which we have or that we have control of and accepting the things that we don't. So stress can be more accurately seen as an equation, right? So we have stressors, and those are either external events that cause us either physical or psychological stress or an emotional reaction, or internal things. So our perceptions about whatnot. So internal and external stressors, our body, both our survival brain and our thinking brain, then appraise that stress and determine how great a threat it is. And then depending on that appraisal, the size of the stressor and the appraisal of the stressor, that's going to determine our activation level. So that is kind of what is really commonly is when people say, I'm feeling stressed, they're feeling that activation in their body from the end point of that equation. Excuse me. The point I want to make here is that back from understanding that honest appraisal of our situations and then that healthy notion of control, as far as stressor goes, there's a lot of stressors that we don't have control over. And so it's important to differentiate between those two things, because if we're trying to affect our feeling of stress, that activation, but we're trying to control stressors that we have no control over, that's going to be frustrating. That's going to give us greater sense of overwhelm or helplessness. And so we want to avoid that. It's going to be defeating. So if you have some stressor in your life that you can manage, Maybe it is your sleep, and you can get more sleep, then you can definitely impact that external stressor. So where stressors are controllable, we encourage you to control them. However, it's a common mistake to be trying to control stressors that aren't controllable. Probably where we have the most power in this equation is our appraisal. So when we develop more skills, our nervous system will appraise threats differently when that body has been conditioned that it can handle greater stressors. And also when we're conscious about maybe our unproductive thinking patterns, maybe it's catastrophizing or blaming or stuff like that, we realize that our thinking habits can be part of the equation that's causing this problem by causing us to misappraise the degree or the severity or the danger of that stressor. So there's a lot of room to move as far as that stress appraisal part of it. That's involving our perspective and our learned skills and understanding that it's not always the action that causes our thoughts, it's our beliefs about what happened that cause our response to it. Then finally, when we are actually activated, when we can very purposely and in a healthy way diffuse that activation, then we're telling our nervous system, that survival brain again, that there is a way to keep the stress activation from getting out of control, but also it's just healthier on us. So when we can diffuse the stress that we're going through, then we can more quickly enter into the recovery state. So 2 principles to take away is 1, move your body. And this means exercising in some way that causes your respiratory rate to increase. And it doesn't have to be really high, but just increase your respiratory rate for 10 to 15 minutes. That will help to diffuse and downregulate your body. And then where you can, just be in community with others and even, speak about your actions. So this is back to that stress continuum. So those are how we evolved to handle external stressors, right? We generally moved our body, either we fled or we fought, and then we were in that small group community that humans have been around for a couple 100,000 years. So deal with stressors if you can, let go of the stressors you can't, work on different ways to build more capacity and to see how your perspectives are impacting your appraisal. And then when you're activated, be very purposeful about diffusing that activation through physical movement and connection with other people. All right, so that's it for stress and resilience, I should say. The next thing that we're going to do is just print off the stress continuum worksheet. It's 1 page, and the object of that is to just get familiar with using it for yourself. Just first reps, take the concept, start applying it to yourself. That's how we learn best. It's going to be defining yourself in green and some other colors, what moves you both ways on the continuum. If we can just start to get more purposeful about that and then develop this common language, remember, this is the first and baseline skills and steps of suicide and PTSD and mental health prevention and awareness. So this is it. Getting into that, understanding yourself better, and then being able to communicate with greater nuance and faculty with less stigma to others is the first step that we're taking to reduce the prevalence of suicide in our whole community and other mental illness. All right, there you have it. Again, I'm Ben O'Brien. I've got an email on the system. I would love to hear your comments and constructive criticism or any questions. There will be much more to follow, more specifically on resilience skills, or you can reach out to me if you have some specific things. The peer support team can support you in developing those individually. And remember, resilient people do things in community or amongst your crew or battalion. All right, be well.